This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery. Smart CSOs are saying, who cares about org structure? I need to be the one that goes across the aisle and says, we're going to do our jobs way better together. Let's find a way to make it happen. Even though we may have different charges from our bosses, we'll both be more successful if we're synced up.
Hello and welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host, Tori Richie. Today I'm joined by a familiar voice, Trevor DaRin. Trevor, you've done a lot of great research this year over the evolving role of the Chief Strategy Officer. Let's talk about some of those key findings and interviews that you've done as of late. Was there a single pattern that emerged across those CSO interviews? What are table stakes for the role?
We went in expecting that there was going to be a bunch of different ways that people approached the CSO role that were all effective. And that's what we found. There was a lot of things that people did differently, but a few of the things they all did similar was everyone knew they had to come with a clear analytical approach. You're either the top of the analytics pyramid in a CSO role, or at the absolute least, you're really relied on as someone who's going to have expertise in which data can answer which questions, being able to come with concise insights from data analyses. Even though that's probably not the day-to-day today, you're still expected to have that as a core foundational skill set. And that speaks to the fact that there's probably three backgrounds of CSOs. The most common in a health system is someone who came up through traditional strategy. And that means for probably 10 plus years of those folks' careers, they were in the trenches doing data analyses all the time, working with new data sets, answering questions, and got a lot better at it over time. The other common background is that you're in an operational role in a health system, and increasingly how much those operational skills and insights are invaluable today. And CSOs are expected to be able to foresee implementation hurdles in any strategy and prioritize accordingly. And the third set of background is coming from out of industry. This is uncommon, not unheard of, but uncommon. It takes a CEO, an executive team that really wants to be pushed and wants an outside perspective, and probably a CEO who wants to give more autonomy to a chief strategy officer to be proactive with new ideas and insights. I'll come back to that word proactive because it's something that came up a lot. Being analytical, and obviously one of those, they're going to be slightly different expectations based on those three backgrounds. The other one that's just a universal is being a great communicator. This is a role where you're usually very visible internally and often externally. It's often the person who is initiating partnerships and taking them as far as the CEO and CFO will let them take it before handing off. And it's someone who has to have a clear, concise message about what the strategic priorities are for the system and be able to communicate that to executives, service line leaders, clinicians, frontline folks. There's not that many people who are expected to do that to so many different audiences, and to be an evangelist for the strategic priorities the systems come up with. So you have to be a great communicator. Part of that is the one that stood out was having a really high EQ. People describe this as sometimes you need to be the quietest voice in the room and manage things behind the scenes. Sometimes you have to be in front of the room leading folks. You have to understand how different audiences are going to process information and tailor accordingly. That's just a core skill set of being a chief strategy officer. You don't get to just be the analytical person. You have to be thinking about how the teams and individuals that you're going to need to implement strategies are going to internalize the strategy making process, the data and insights you're bringing to that process, and how they feel that's disrupting their current world, and how do you get them on the bus.
To that end, different markets and different teams are going to need different types of individuals to come to the table. While there are a number of things that seem to be pretty consistent in terms of how CSOs are approaching the role today, what were some of the differentiators that you heard? And are you able to tie where folks are taking a different approach to this role, to executing in this capacity? Can you identify key market drivers or key impacts within their organization that are forcing them to look at the role a bit differently?
Yeah, that's fair. Academics and enormous systems had CSOs that had a bigger scope. And that makes sense because they've been a central voice on the AMC side and thinking about how to shift services and backfill capacity, which many AMCs have surprisingly done quicker than others. And there's just more complicated moving pieces and the balance between the university and the health system, the complexity of the role of faculty and clinicians. There's a lot of folks who've been in those roles a really long time who have a lot of cachet and influence both internally internally and externally. And then the big national systems have a really hard ask of their CSOs. They're often a huge part of M&A discussions, which take up a lot of time and energy, but increasingly in scale and systemness initiatives. And you're trying to do that and build relationships with physicians across a distributed geography of 5 or 6 states. Inevitably, it's going to be less about being hands-on with implementation and more about laying the groundwork and building relationships. That probably leans even harder on the EQ and communicator skills. So that's one difference across health systems. The other thing that was a big spread across the 20 plus CSOs we talked to was how they thought about their role as proactive or reactive. Universally, people accepted the CEO is the top of the strategy team. CEO stressed the strategy. Now, there's different ways in which CSOs tried to influence that, being proactive or reactive, but someone even had a great quote. Even proactive stuff can seem reactive because it doesn't always get traction until it's real. You can feel like you're pushing something, but then people aren't going to deal with it until it's right in front of them.
When I think about how much the healthcare landscape has changed over the last 5 years, that signals to me as well that likely the role and the responsibilities of folks, particularly in the C-suite, they need to evolve with those changes. I'm curious, is there that recognition across the folks that are actually embedded in those positions? And what is their take on how they need to stay nimble and not necessarily hold the past as their guide for how they approach the job?
CSOs are very dialed into this need to change because unlike every other role in the C-suite, their role is not as clearly defined. They constantly have to make a mandate that's going to keep them relevant. One of the things they have to be great at is seeing what the org's going to need next and making sure they're half a step ahead of the game and that they have a team that can deliver on that new ask. For example, when strategy was pretty much volume growth is going to be a successful, good thing for our organization. And if we can grow volume, we're in good shape, which isn't the case anymore in most markets. Strategy could be more siloed from teams like marketing, contracting, BD. They each had their own charge, but they usually weren't synced up on here's how we're all three working on the same system level priorities and strategies that could create missteps and overlap. But ultimately, it wasn't the expectation on strategy team that they were going to be the hub of that. That's changing. The complexity around capturing the right growth, being really precise about making sure systems have access to capture places where they're pushing. You can't have a system initiative on CV growth when you don't have access there, but then marketing's pushing a lever that's going to increase for this upstream funnel for that service. And at the same time, contracting hasn't shifted to match the rate shift to the outpatient space, and they're still focused on inpatient. You've totally missed the balance of those three things. And I think systems realize that right now, 5 or 10% growth isn't just going to walk in the front door. Those three things are going to have to be more synced up. And that's really tough. Increasingly, I'm hearing teams take pretty dramatic steps to try to do that, whether it's embedding teammates on each other's teams, looking at the contracting team and saying, you guys are incredible at negotiating with, face it, an incredibly tough party across the table, but we're going to embed someone on your team whose job is contracting strategy and making sure that there's alignment between where we're pushing for rate changes, accepting rate changes, and how that's going to match the growth that we think is organically going to come in the market and that we think we can target and capture. Similarly, with marketing, we've heard too many stories of they don't all report up through the same place. It's easy to get misaligned. Smart CSOs are saying, who cares about org structure? I need to be the one that goes across the aisle and says, we're going to do our jobs way better together. Let's find a way to make it happen. Even though we may have different charges from our bosses, we'll both be more successful if we're synced up. And there's probably 3 or 4 others across the system that CSOs are working with more and more, but those are really the biggies.
That last piece is an interesting point because when I think of the role of the strategy office, in my mind, they are the great conveners of the system. They are the individuals that do have to work across teams, make sure that we're aligned on the key initiatives, areas of resource investment and the like. In your interviews, did you come across any key lessons learned that CSOs have experienced recently as it pertains to the strategy office being in a position where they need to work more agilely and more nimbly, but needing to make sure that they bring everybody else in the organization along?
This was a really smart quote. Big academic system, leader who's been there a long time, said we can't be messing around with strategies that can't be implemented. That really says instead of making the chief financial officer, Mrs. or Mr. No, where you come to them with an idea and just wait for them to bat it down. The expectation on CSOs is that they've thought through the implementation timeline, hurdles, teams, places, what's going to have to move, where is it going to be disruptive, how's it going to sync with financial planning. And that's just a baseline expectation, especially at a big, complicated system like this. That's not brand new, but it's an increasing importance because there's such a premium on not getting it wrong because systems are taking fewer bets. So if you're only making 4 or 5 bets, you have to be pretty certain, here's what the implementation runway is going to look like, the milestones we have to hit. Often the CSOs are the grease in that engine who has built the relationships and worked with the teams beforehand so that they're not surprised by something new and obviously brought them into the strategy planning process along the way.
That signals an expanded role of the strategy office. This isn't a new concept. Strategy should not occur within a vacuum, but scaling these types of initiatives is perhaps the next evolution of expanding the breadth in the capture and the area of focus that the strategy office needs to really have control of. With that, how are teams executing on these initiatives? What are they doing to ensure that they have the right individuals across the organization?
First, it's also a premium skill across the C-suite. Everyone didn't come to the CSO and say, you need to do this. Chief nursing officers have an elevated role in the C-suite right now because of how valuable and their impact on the workforce through the pandemic. And then they've maintained that. COOs as well. CFOs are very much expected to still be Mrs. or Mr. No, because resources and capital are extremely tight right now. All 3 of those roles also has a premium on understanding and having really deep visibility into operations and implementation. And frankly, they probably have easier pipelines to that information in those teams and relationships than a CSO. It's not going to be given to the strategy team that everyone else is going to make this easier for them. It speaks to their competence around emotional intelligence and being great communicators to be able to build those relationships, even when it's a little bit of a turf fight, let's be totally honest, because everyone wants to be the one who implemented a successful strategy and feels like it's their teams and relationships that everyone leaned on for that. As far as strategy teams beneath the CSO, how they've tried to evolve to match this, teams are recruiting more from operators than from strictly analytics or strategy backgrounds. That also speaks to the expectation that in the next few years, data and insights just going to get faster and cheaper. And face it, every service line leader, site leader, clinical leader is probably going to have tools where they can spit out all kinds of data reports, automated, quickly, easily, AI enabled. The value of a person who can do that work is going to change, and you need folks who are more strategic thinkers and understand the operational hurdles and the people and the systems in place. That switch isn't going to flip overnight, but many talked about the increased value of recruiting past operators to the strategy team.
I like that. And from your perspective, that combined with the reality in 5 or 10% growth isn't just going to walk in the door. How is that changing the CSO's approach to growth? How is that evolving?
In the CSO strategy leadership world, they talk about what's the strategy mandate? What has the strategy team been asked to do? And historically, and in markets where there's just organic growth, Nashville, Dallas, Charleston, there's probably 10 markets around the country. That's really still the primary focus because you can get to 10+% growth by focusing on local competition, new sites. You're going to be precise about there's some growth that's better than others, but it's really about capturing volume. In other places, the mandates are way more nuanced. There's still a segment of health systems that are going to be focused on financial sustainability. At this stage of the game, that's often smaller systems, which maybe don't even have a CSO. But we had to acknowledge that there's a segment that ultimately you can't come to that organization with, here's our 5 growth priorities, when the real focus is getting margins back to positive or getting from 1.5% to 3 or 4, something that feels more sustainable. That's 2 buckets, easy growth and financial sustainability. And then there was like 2 other buckets of mandates that have some overlaps, but also some pretty unique things. The first is systems that have grown a lot through M&A, whether they're done or not. They've said this kind of overlaps with financial sustainability, like to get to a level of financial health that allows us to grow, service our very expensive aging facilities, et cetera. We really have to do some things at scale that maybe it's clinical scale, maybe it's service distribution, but you, Chief Strategy Officer, have to be a piece of that. It's not just operational, it's not just clinical. We need a strategic lens on where we should do this, where we should do it first, and where's going to have the biggest impact. And there's a a set of systems that have been asked to do that. And that's a really big charge for a chief strategy officer. And you can see how the folks that they would recruit and bring in are going to have a little different backgrounds than others. The fourth group, and this is a pretty broad umbrella, but those who've been told like the ship's not sinking, we have okay margins, but we know that we're going to need to transform our operating model, the way in which we engage with patients, the way patients use our system as a front door, the way we can triage and manage our capacity. And we need strategy to be a part of that, to understand what the priorities are and how we can transform incrementally. There's a set that are saying, we know we need to change. We're a big battleship, but we need to start turning, and we need a CSO to help us identify the things that we need to do differently next year and 10 years from now and show us the path between those two places. And that's also a big challenging charge, but one that has a big range of flexibility and impact. And again, you can kind of immediately see how valuable the role of relationships are with operators to make that happen.
Trevor, that succinctly gets us to how this role is evolving and the need for those CSOs acting as those conveners, working on communicating across their health systems, big, small, academic or not, then starting to focus on being more proactive versus taking a rather traditional reactive approach. Appreciate you coming on the podcast today to share some of the findings from your recent CSO interviews.
This was super fun research, and thanks to all those members who participated. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at Sg2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, Sg2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You can find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.